Well, thank you very much for coming. I'm actually up to 35 books now. I, I write a book when I can't find one on a subject. And that actually started with my first book was about the Inca because I wanted to find a little book that told the whole Inca history in like 150 pages, and it didn't exist. So I had this stack of pages next to my computer, and my wife, Irene, said, "Why don't you write a book?" And I went, "Oh, okay." So she's the one that started me on this. I'm going to, the way I do this is it's like a stream of consciousness because there's so much information involved, and it's going to go quite fast. I'm sorry, it's just the way that I do it. So I'll be presenting 160 slides. So don't focus too much on them, but each one is a piece of an incredibly complicated story, which will make sense to you. So please don't ask questions until the end. There'll be plenty of time for that. It's just that when I do a talk and somebody puts their hand up, then my whole attention goes, off somewhere. And other than that, I'm going to be doing the whole thing in Portuguese. So if that's a problem. No, this just happens to be that my book was published in, or this book was published in Brazil, which is nice. Brazilians are amazing at their, at their fascination with the paranormal or anything that's weird. So I've had the great fortune to go to Brazil 3 times so far. If you haven't been, it's a wonderful country, and the people are just phenomenally nice. So, okay, I will do it in English. And so this book I wrote specifically about the elongated skulls in Peru and Bolivia because that's the highest concentration of anywhere on Earth. They did exist in other parts of the world, but many different cultures perform cranial deformation, and the picture you see is based on an actual skull. The artist is Marcia Moore, who lives in Florida. And she's a fine artist. She's not a forensic artist, but she simply, I send her a photograph or a series, and she builds what she interprets based on that. She doesn't go, well, I think it might be alien, or I think it might be this. She's very straight. So she gives us a glimpse into these people who existed, at least in terms of the Paracas. They lived on the coast of Peru between 2,000 and 3,000 years ago, and no academic is studying them, which I found completely bizarre. But it's typical, as you've experienced at Contact and other conferences. Academics in general are stuck in boxes. And the Inca, of course, are a famous, fabulous ancient culture. But the only thing about the Paracas they study are they try to interpret the textiles. And it's like, what about the heads? Well, it's all head binding. It's like, really? You know, I come from a scientific background. With a major in biology. So when I first saw one of these in a little museum, I just thought, how do you bind that? It's you know, you're really altering the shape here a lot. So I looked up in the literature on the internet, and there's almost nothing. Nobody's been studying them at all since the 1970s. So is this a cover-up or what? So that started my journey about 10 years ago. And supposedly I'm the world authority, I don't know, but it's just, I'm a very obsessive person when it comes to information. So I like to get to the bottom of things. And this is another book I wrote prior to that with David Hatcher Childress, and it looked at cranial deformation around the world. Like, what cultures did it, when did they do it, why did they do it? And the basic commonality, whether it's in Melanesia or Germany or the Black Sea or the Congo, many different places, is it was a way to distinguish the nobility from the general population. So it's the royal bloodline did this to their children so that everyone could go, oh, that's a noble person. But that's the main commonality. The other thing is that most of these cultures thought that this is a very aesthetic thing, very beautiful thing. And more mysteriously, that is what the ancestors looked like, which is the most curious part of it. And I'm also going to be talking about Akhenaten, who is the only pharaoh I find interesting. Well, the others, honestly, it seems were quite very arrogant people, like especially Ramses II, who had his cartouche put everywhere. And so Akhenaten was a very special character for many different reasons, and whenever I talk about elongated skulls, everybody automatically says, well, Akhenaten had an elongated skull and he was an alien. It's like, really? Let's look at the scientific facts. The story is actually much more interesting. Like, he's a very interesting character. And this is my latest book, which I published 3 days ago. And it contains all of the DNA results that took 4 years to get at a cost of $100,000, which luckily I didn't have to pay for. But people took immediate interest when we started to do the DNA testing because it had never been done before. And so we did some initial sampling, which came up with very interesting results. And luckily, we were able, through this process, to study 20 different skulls, which is a good database size. And the results, you will see, are quite remarkable. And again, we had to work with the Ministry of Culture of Peru because these are pre-Columbian artifacts. And that process took 3 years to get the paperwork back and permission. So a crew was sent down from the US to take the samples and take them out of Peru, and they went to three different laboratories. And then I was given the results, and I presented the results to the Ministry of Culture. So there was no possibility of government cover-up because the results came to us first, then to the government. And so they wrote a little report, and it went into a drawer and will never be seen again. And that's why I made YouTube videos that have been seen 1 million times. Because this information belongs to you. All of this information belongs to humanity, not to a small group of elite people who try to control. That whole paradigm is, as you know, is collapsing now because they can't control this stuff. It's moving too fast. And we deserve to know this stuff. So I dedicate this, I get very emotional. This is my mentor, Senior Juan. I'll get over it. Here he is. He was, I think, the world authority on the area of Paracas on the coast of Peru. He was an amateur archaeologist, but he knew more after studying 40 years in the field than any academic. And he was shunned by them because he didn't have a PhD. But for 6 years, I stuck to him like glue. And you see what he's holding is an elongated skull with red hair. And we obtained that at one point. There are local people who, unfortunately, are tomb robbers. And we put the word out, if you find skulls, bring them to our museum and we'll pay you for them. Otherwise, they wind up on the black market and out of the country. So we got this one, and it was wrapped up in very fine ceremonial cloth. So automatically you know this is a person of nobility. And I said, Senior Juan, can we unwrap it? And he said, no, this belongs to the Ministry of Culture. We can't do that. So for 2 years, I kept asking him, can we open? Nope, no, can't. And so finally, he got so basically pissed off with the Ministry of Culture because he would send them reports. We would go into the field to ancient cemeteries and find that people had been freshly dug up from 2,000 years ago. So he would take photos and send reports to them. They never responded. So eventually he said, well, let's get an archaeologist from Peru and let's open it up. And this is the day we did. And that characteristic by itself, the red hair, automatically means that you're not looking at a native Peruvian from 2,000 years ago. And these are different types of head binding techniques that have been done around the world. Basically, you start with a newborn child because their skull is quite malleable, and gradually over the course of 3 years, without hurting, you can't hurt the baby. You have to do this very carefully and very slowly to flatten the front and the back of the skull. And again, by doing that, that makes, after 3 years, the skull is fully calcified, and so for the rest of their life, they will look like that. And again, different parts of the world. On the left is, up until recent times, the people in the Ucayali region of Peru in the jungle. You see the binding? Then the middle one is a lady of nobility from the west coast of Canada. And the one on the right is literally a flat-head woman from Oregon or Washington. And these, whenever you go into a museum that has these skulls, these are the different types of binding that they will show you. And in the case of the Inca, this was the process, front and back. But the one on the left, they say this is Inca, but it's not. The one on the left is a Paracas skull. So again, the misinformation campaigns that go on in museums are quite alarming. I'm sure you've been into museums where if they have a diorama that's prior to 10,000 years ago, they always show a woolly mammoth being attacked by primitive hunters and stuff like that. So it's like, these corny things. Even in the Cusco Museum, they show that. So again, we have global distribution, the Maya, the mound builders, Pacific Northwest, different places in South America, but mainly in Peru and Bolivia. And then Attila the Hun had a elongated skull. Interesting news story is that Maria Wheatley is a researcher in England, and she was able to get access to elongated skulls that had been unearthed at Stonehenge. And what they have in that area are called long barrows and round barrows. And the long barrows, which are ancient funeral sites, in the long barrows, elongated skulls were found. And in round barrows, normal people were found. So that's quite recent. And also in Melanesia, possibly in Egypt, but we'll get into that. So about Akhenaten, most of my knowledge comes from these two men, Stephen Mailer on the right, and his teacher, Abdel Hakim Awian, who was the greatest guide in Egypt. He started when he was 6 years old, and he was the guide for John Anthony West and Robert Bauval, et cetera, et cetera. What made him special was that he had 2 university degrees in archaeology, but he also was a wisdom keeper of the ancient knowledge of his people, the pre-dynastic people and the dynastic people. So he understood what is called the Suf language, which is the original Egyptian language. Suf, that's where Sufi comes from. But Sufi comes from, sorry? Native American? No, that's Sioux. Suf. And the key to that, which I'll get into in my other talk, is the fact that you can decode the sites in Egypt based on the original name. The original name is telling you what the place was. So, Akhenaten, the great enigma. Stephen Mailer spent 40 years studying this man more than any other. So it's from him that I draw much of my information. And what made him really intriguing was that he was very much a member of the mystery schools of ancient Egypt. He had access to that information because he was of noble blood. Most of the other pharaohs probably didn't care, but he was fascinated by it, and he knew that his lineage went way, way, way back in time, more than 12,000 years. And so that's why he didn't care how he was portrayed. He, of course, was married to Nefertiti, and all of their artifacts, or all of the artifacts related to Akhenaten, have been damaged, like these two busts with the noses broken off. That was done on purpose by what was called the Amun priesthood, who were in power at the time of his birth. They controlled everything. They were the original religion. Before that, Egypt was a spiritual place, but then religion became a specific thing. And Amun is where we get Amen. And Amen does not mean thy will be done. It means let it remain hidden. So that's where you have the control by religious people for the first time, probably. And so they tried to eradicate any sign of his existence. He's even taken off at Abydos in Egypt, there's a big panel that has all of the dynasties, and he's missing, as is Tutankhamun. So we know his ancestry. His father was Amenhotep III. And what Amenhotep means is the devotee of Amun, which means he is at the disposal and an underling of the Amun priesthood. So he had no role whatsoever in society, because they said, don't worry, Pharaoh. You just stay at home. We'll take care of the politics. We'll take care of the wars. They stripped all of his power from him. And so Akhenaten, who was called Amenhotep IV, he grew up with this. And the more he learned about his ancient people, the more he basically got pissed off. And he changed his name from Amenhotep, or the devotee, to Akhenaten, which means the shadow of Aten. And so most people think that he invented monotheism, but in fact what he did is he brought back the ancient concept of one God. So this goes long before the Jewish people, long before anybody else. The one whole divine, which is called Aten. And Aten is everything. Aten is space and time, past and present and future, birds, fish, my sandals, etc. So this one concept. So a lot of Egyptologists have that wrong. They think he invented it. But that's why he called himself the shadow of Aten, because he said, I'm bringing it back. There's too much disunity. There are too many little gods here. People are getting confused. Too much control. You know, I am the Pharaoh. I am the caretaker of the people. I need my power to help the people. So some people think that he had a disease called Marfan syndrome. But again, to him, the way that he was portrayed, he didn't care. He told his artists, portray me the way I am, because he was spiritually very evolved, and so his body meant nothing to him. So that's where the confusion comes in with all of these carvings and drawings and things of him. People go, well, he had to have an elongated head. His skull has never been found. His body's never been found. Nefertiti's body has never been found, even though Zahi Hawass would like to think he has. But what Zahi Hawass would do is, if things got boring after 10 years, he would find something. So we have found Nefertiti. It's like, no. So again, this concept of Aten is everything. The sun was a symbol of the divine creator. The sun was not worshipped. The sun was symbolic of the source, of where everything comes from. And that was the same concept the Inca had. The Inca didn't worship the sun. They saw the sun as the bringer of life. And so you like to have people like to have symbols. That's why if you see a cross, you go, oh, there's Christ. So for the Inca and the ancient Egyptians, the sun was symbolic. And it was not simply called Ra. There are actually 5 stages to the sun, and this we learn from Abdel Hakim Awiyan. The 5 stages of the day. So you start with Keper, which is the dung beetle pushing the dung ball, and that's symbolic of the sun rising. And then the second stage is called Ra, which represents the ram, and that's the teenage person. That's where the sun is building its power and can be slightly erratic, like a teenager human is. And then you have Un, from where we get noon, and that's the beginning of becoming mature. Then you have Aten, which is full enlightenment. And then you have twilight, and you have Amen, which is darkness. So again, that's where the whole control thing began. And as well, the 5 stages of the sun are 5 stages of the day, 5 stages of a human life, and 5 stages of the great cycle of time. So when you take that all into consideration, we're looking at the time of Aten being at least 12,000 years ago. So much older than the dynastic people who have been around for 5,500 years possibly. So again, everywhere we see symbols of Akhenaten and Nefertiti, they're either partially or totally obliterated. So his face has been scratched off. In this is actually an example of mild destruction, but in some cases, huge destruction of trying to wipe his existence out of the historical record, but it didn't work. The most profound thing he did was he decided to move the capital of Egypt. Because of the corruption of the Amen priesthood, he said, we can't stay in Thebes anymore because I need power, or not power for myself, but I need power to be able to take care of my people. He wasn't a ruler over the people, he was a ruler for the people. Very different concept. So he decided to move the entire royal family and whoever wanted to come with him to a site at Amarna called Akhenaten, which means the dawn of Aten, or the rebirth. And most archaeologists think that this was a virgin site on the Nile, but it's not. Again, he was very much into symbolism. He found an ancient megalithic site, and again, symbolic of rebirth. We're going to rebuild this place. Very hard to get to this location, but we did once, and it was really quite amazing, because this is what it looked like in its prime, and that's what it looks like today. Just wiped off the map. They destroyed every single building, the Amen priesthood. They rebuilt their power because he had basically fired them all, just like how Jesus fired the Pharisees. And they wouldn't put up with that. So they sent an army and they eradicated the city. And this is all that's left. And these are made of fiberglass. It's really, I couldn't believe it. I thought, oh, at least there are a couple of columns, and I went up, bonk. Oh, God. So, so here's Stephen Mailer, and this is winter solstice, and this is where the sun is reborn. So this location was chosen partially because of that little cleft in the mountains. That's in winter solstice, the sun rises right there. So again, Akhenaten was using symbolism. But what people may not know is there are huge chambers in the side of the mountain just above it. And of course we got to go there and had to pay to have the doors unlocked, which is typical of Egypt, but money always works. And inside are these huge megalithic chambers that had to be done using lost ancient high technology in the very distant past. And so Akhenaten clearly knew that this was a site built by very advanced people or very advanced beings a long time ago, and that's why he chose it. He didn't choose virgin territory. He said, let's go back to that location and I'll bring it back to life. But again, in the presentations, you see Akhenaten and Nefertiti both wearing hats which insinuate elongated heads, and their daughters are always portrayed with elongated heads. So if they didn't have them physically, then why do this depiction? For example, this is Mary Taten, which means the beloved of Aten. This is one of his 6 daughters. And this is another portrayal. It's not a slightly elongated head. It's major backwards. And to be truthful, I think what he was doing was he was connecting himself to